What if we take Yuji and Megumi at the end of JJK and swap them? Let's talk about it. All right, so first of all, shout out to Caboose for the question and for the support today. And as you can see here, he says, what would happen if Megumi and Yuji's places were switched in the final Sukuna fight? Meaning Sukuna regains his full power and takes over Yuji's body. Meanwhile, Megumi trains with everyone else as the backup to Gojo. And there's two parts to this question. First, would Megumi and everyone else be able to beat Sukuna and save Yuji after the Gojo duel? And second, would Gojo even lose this version of the fight with Sukuna at full power, still in Yuji's body instead of Megumi's, and thus he wouldn't have the 10 shadows? So let's talk about this. All right, first let's talk about the second part of this question, which is how would this duel have differed if Sukuna had been in Yuji sans the 10 shadows, right? And for those of you that have been around the channel for a while, you'll know that this is something we've talked about before. And you guys are probably tired of hearing me say this, but I'm going to say it again. I've always viewed these two as roughly equal. From a narrative standpoint, they are both depictions of absolute strength, right? And this was the pinnacle of Jujutsu in the entire manga, right? So it just doesn't make sense to me that either one would vastly outclass the other under any circumstances. Meaning, whether it's Yuji Kuna, Megami Kuna, or true form Sukuna, I think on any given Sunday, either one of these two could win. Now, Sukuna obviously did win because that's the direction the story had to go, right? Gojo can never win this fight under any circumstances because then JJK is just over and we don't actually get to have these moments from the main cast, right? He's a side character. He's everybody's favorite side character, but he's a side character at the end of the day. He can't win this fight, right? So Sukuna still wins, and he has win conditions to do it with. He's got domain amp, but primarily domain expansion. And obviously his entire strategy would be slightly different compared to what it was in Megumi's body because he was trying to upgrade his arsenal by learning from Mahoraga. He obviously doesn't need to do that, or he can't do that in Yuji's body, right? So I think primarily it becomes a battle of attrition with whose brain's going to get fried first from their domain expansion battles, right? But you got to remember that Sukuna learned from Gojo, like the refreshing of his brain to get the domain back up. That wasn't something that Sukuna came into this fight with. So I think it's a bit disingenuous to say that like Sukuna just wins easily if he doesn't have to worry about adapting with Mahoraga. Yeah, his strategy's different. Maybe he has some pathways that are arguably easier if he doesn't have to worry about that, but it's definitely not a foregone conclusion. I think Gojo could easily win this fight as well. But again, he never will win it because Sukuna has to win to keep the story progressing. So at the end of the day, hypothetically in a vacuum, either one can win. But in the story, if we're swapping in this what if scenario Yuji and Megami, of course, Yuji Sukuna is still going to win. Now we get to the juicy part of this question, which is, would Megami and everyone else be able to finish off Sukuna after the Gojo duel and successfully save Yuji, the same way that Yuji and everybody else defeated Sukuna and saved Megami? And this is really interesting because we know that that was in large part thanks to Yuji's unique ability to perceive and strike the soul. Not only was that weakening Sukuna, allowing him to be defeated, but it is also what allowed them to strip Sukuna away from Megami, saving him. So how on earth are Megami and everybody else going to tackle this problem? And the story has to drastically change from here. Now, what do I mean by that? Just that a lot of elements are going to have to shift and move to make this make sense in the first place, right? Not the least of which is that Megami is going to be our main character now, which ironically enough, he was supposed to be the main character in the original iteration of Jujutsu Kaisen. So that's kind of fun. But yeah, obviously the story is going to move through him. He's going to be the driving force through this climax. And I don't think like the main narratives or messages need to change at all. They all still apply. It's just going to be a slightly different lens through him, which I do think is interesting because it represents a kind of nice breaking of the cycle. The same way Yuji did, but that was more focused on him and Sukuna, right? I think this is going to be more focused on Gojo and the Zenin clan and like the sins of the past and how like the same thing has always happened. But now you have the de facto Zenin clan head, the 10 Shadows user, choosing to work with others, not consolidate power for themselves. All of the lessons he learned from Gojo, basically. And Gojo, who tragically had to kill his best friend Geto, the stark difference here is Megumi is going to do everything in his power to actually save Yuji and not follow down that same path. Again, kind of the same things that were apparent with Yuji, but they just take on a slightly different tone with Megumi, but a tone that I think really works. And the other big thing is that we need a reason for why Yuji can no longer control Sukuna. If he's out here just piloting his body at 20 fingers, we have to make that make sense because we know that Yuji was a prison for Sukuna, right? And the easy answer could be like, oh, once he reached 20, it was just too much and he couldn't control it. But that's not fun. So let's cook up something else. Instead, I think it would be fun if we looped Kenjaku into this, because after all, he created Yuji to be the perfect vessel. So maybe Yuji was only a prison up to a certain point by design, as a way to keep a leash on Sukuna, which was basically the case in the original timeline, right? Until things were ready for things to pop off, for the merger and everything, right? So maybe Yuji was a prison until the moment they were ready to go, right? And that could be when it reaches 20 fingers, it could be whatever, right? And just like they had to bury Megumi's soul by Sukuna killing Sumiki and then taking the bath, I think there would also need to be a moment where Yuji was just absolutely devastated at his lowest that allowed Sukuna to jump in the pilot seat permanently. And I think you could loop in some flashbacks with his parents to really sell this home, because obviously there's no Sumiki that can really fill that role. But what if Yuji finally remembers the truth about like what happened with his parents? And we can make this like as dark and traumatic and horrifying as we want to make it so that Yuji is crushed here, right? Like maybe Kaori and Yuji's father were pregnant with Yuji pre Kenjaku meddling in their lives, but then he comes in, kills his mom, takes over the pregnancy. Then after Yuji's born, kills his dad. Again, you can make it as awful as you want to explain why Yuji would just sink further and further into despair, and boom, now Sukuna is in control. And we have the same storyline of them needing to get through to him. We can lead up to this very same moment, except it's Yuji that's just given up on life, especially after having killed Gojo by his own hands, right? But I'll talk more about this a little bit later. Now that we've got all the pieces set up and the narratives make sense, now we got to talk about, would Megumi and co. be able to finish off Sukuna again without Yuji's soul punches and black flashes really carrying the weight? How are they going to do this? And here's where I think we would have a great chance to make Potential Man finally meet his potential. Because just like we saw Yuji have an exponential growth during that month training with the swap training, here we would have Megumi really come into his own. People like to clown on him, but you got to remember just how talented he really is. I mean, yes, his domain was incomplete, but he had a domain expansion as a first year at like 15 years old. Not only that, in the original timeline, we know that Sukuna even chose him as a vessel because of the vast amount of potential he had. So imagine a Megami who is now fully primed and ready to realize his potential, having a whole month to train with a post-prison realm Gojo. And not only train, but swap train, right? Imagine Gojo in the driver's seat of the Ten Shadows technique and all of the things he would be able to teach Megumi about it, the things that his genius could realize about them, just the two of them working together exponentially, right? And I thought about who else Megumi might swap with, and I think there's a few interesting possibilities. I don't think he would need to swap with Kusakabe for the same reasons that Yuji did, especially since he already had a domain. I feel like Megumi could learn simple domain pretty easily. So maybe he would swap with Akotsu to get his RCT down pat, but I mean, really anyone, and that's even more growth. Now, you already know where I'm going with this because obviously we need Megumi to tame Mahoraga for them to have a real shot at defeating Sukuna. So how is he going to do this? Even if he trains with Gojo, Akotsu, whoever else, right? This is still a tall order because it's something he has to do by himself. Or does he? Because I think this what if scenario would be the perfect place to loop in this fun theory we've talked about for a while now, and that is that the Ten Shadows and the heavenly restricted users in the Zenin clan were connected by fate because they were there to help a Ten Shadows user tame Mahoraga. Because they have zero cursed energy, perhaps they wouldn't be recognized by the subjugation ritual, meaning Megumi and Maki could 2v1 Mahoraga. I just think this would be such a sick full circle moment for so many reasons. You know, you got the crown jewel of the Zenin clan, the Tin Shadows, now working in tandem with the shame of the Zenin clan, the heavenly restriction. Now things finally whole as they should be. The same way that, Megami and Toji, the one who originally set off the events of the story, were father and son. And Toji, took his own life, sparing his son, paving the way for his son in the next iteration of the heavenly restricted user to fully put things back where they should be. It's just great, right? And I think you could do some really cool things with the reveal of this, which is what I want to talk about next. Just like in the original timeline, we had flashbacks to the planning stages of how they were training and how they were going to deal with Sukuna. This would be a massive reveal that Megami had actually tamed Mahoraga. And for the majority of the fight, we wouldn't see Mahoraga and we wouldn't see the Dharma Chakra wheel or anything. And we would just assume, like, yeah, no one's ever been able to tame Mahoraga. Megami didn't either. But then we would get the flashbacks of Megami and Maki having worked together to take him down and the reveal that Megami actually had it the entire time. Now, why would it have been a secret? Why wouldn't Megami have been using it the entire time? Well, I think this would be the crux of their strategy against Sukuna. Again, we wouldn't have ever had Sukuna piloting the Tin Shadows to show us the cool ways you can use it. So, Megami would have been hiding the Dharma Chakra wheel in his shadow, the same way Sukuna was originally doing it, and having Mahoraga adapt to everything Sukuna was doing throughout the fight until he had fully adapted, and boom, he reveals that he's been wielding the Dharma Chakra the whole time and that he's had Mahoraga tamed this entire time. And now and only now that Mahoraga is essentially going to be invulnerable to what Sukuna can throw at him, he brings him out into the fight. Now, this wouldn't be just the moment they win or anything, because this is still Sukuna we're talking about, but I think Mahoraga would make up for the damage that Yuji was doing with his soul punches by being like the threat to Sukuna. But now we still have the big question of how are they actually going to free Yuji from Sukuna? Here's where we would recontextualize this scene, because again, we would have Yuji in Megami's place having completely given up. But in Yuji's place wouldn't be Megami, it would be Nobara. And we would reframe her triumphant comeback as the way that they were able to get a brief moment to speak with Yuji in that soul realm. It would have been through Nobara's resonance that allowed that quick message. And this would have given Yuji the spark of hope he needed that would allow him to start fighting back against Sukuna. This would pave the way for us to have a rematch of Yuji versus Sukuna within the innate domain for who will be in control. And this would parallel the very first meeting and fight they had in here at the start of the series, where Sukuna basically just one-shots him, right? So we would have this epic fight happening within the innate domain, while also the fight between Megami, Mahoraga, and Sukuna was happening on the outside. And I feel like there'd be some really cool potential here to like paint back and forth between the two, and like each blow that Yuji successfully landed in here like weakened Sukuna outside and vice versa, until ultimately they were able to put him down and Yuji was able to regain control. This quickly just became my fan ending for this what if scenario, I guess, but to ultimately answer your question, yes, I do think that Megami and Co. would be able to find a way to get it done, because ultimately that's what the narrative needs to have happen, right? But again, if we're going to talk in a hypothetical vacuum scenario, I do think it would be far more difficult because what Yuji provided was crucial in that fight. I'm telling y'all, the reveal of Megami having had tamed Mahoraga the whole time and pulling out the Dharma Chakra wheel from his shadow and wearing it himself would have gone so hard. So Caboose, thank you so much for the fun question today, and y'all let me know what you think about all this.